I think one of the things we've noticed is that the talk of evangelism seems to be in a bit of a decline. And so one of the things we're interested in exploring this season is why that is the case. Is there something going on in the wide culture? Is there something going on in Christian culture? Is there something going on individually for us, which is sort of slowed down this momentum of evangelism, that we don't feel an urgency about it. Maybe we feel an awkwardness about it. And so we want to explore that from a number of different angles.
Welcome everybody back to the Shock Absorber podcast. We've had a little bit of a break over Christmas, but we are back with season 5, and we're here in the Third Space studio. And if you remember last season, we talked about culture and in Ian Hussey's words about embracing and critiquing culture, which leads very nicely into this season, season 5, as I said, which we have decided to call Whatever Happened to Evangelism. Now, I've got half the usual gang joining me today. Tim, how are you?
I'm going really well.
Excellent.
Thanks, mate.
It's we've given Stu a bit of time off.
Yep.
He's well-deserved time off because he's just come off the back of Ethan, his son's wedding, which is great, and he married his son, which was a very lovely occasion, and we were both there. You emceed the reception.
Oh, I did have the opportunity at the very last minute.
Yes, it was the very last minute.
Fill in for another one of our pastors, Jai, who unfortunately got sick.
Yes.
Yep, but no, it was great joy to be there and celebrate with Stu and Ethan, obviously, and Katie and the rest of the family and friends.
I had a lot of fun.
Yeah, it was an awesome time.
Yes, it was great. And also joining us today is Braden, our student pastor here at Soul Revival Church. He's actually behind the desk though. Hello, Braden.
Yeah, I get to be the fun radio host over here.
As you were joking, you've got a face for radio with me before.
Perfect.
Well, let's get into it. We're talking about evangelism in this particular season. Tim, I think the best way to start to maybe talk about evangelism is to use a cultural artefact, which we usually like to do. And I think you came up with this idea previously, and it is the Jesus beads. Do you want us to tell us about the Jesus beads and why it was an important cultural artefact as you were growing up as a Christian? Yeah,
so this is a sort of a cultural artefact that's kind of, it's a Soul Revival cultural artefact as opposed to maybe a popular one. But when I was growing up in the early Soul Revival, so I was a teenager in youth group through the mid to late 90s. And one of the things that was really significant for us was this, we called them the Jesus beads or the gospel beads. And so there were 5 colours and they represented the full story of the Bible. And the way we told the story was that there was green, that God created everything, white, that God created humankind to be particularly his special people and to live with them. And there was the white represents the cleanliness, the wholeness of that relationship that they have with God in the beginning. So Adam and Eve in Genesis chapter 2. And then black comes next, and that represents the way that perfect, clean, beautiful relationship was ruined through sin and the rebellion of Adam and Eve and the fact that we've all inherited that sin. And so we are naturally outside of relationship with God. After black, we've got red, which is both the love of Christ and the blood of Christ, that he showed his love for us ultimately by dying on the cross and rising again. And through that sacrifice, we're able to be cleansed from our sin and be brought back into relationship with God. And then the last one in the way we tell the story is the yellow bead, which represents the new life that we have, which starts now when we're in Christ and lasts for eternity through new creation. So those 5 colours, green, white, black, red, yellow, were really significant and were quite an important semiotic, a sign to us as teenagers and the youth community that we're a part of who we are in Jesus and the story that we were seeking to live out.
And how, I feel like at the time that they were most popular was a time that you were really, you were right in that forefront of that. How did it help you personally be able to share the gospel?
Yeah, so I think it did a couple of things. Firstly, it really identified who we were as Christians. And so there was a signifier of the people who are wearing these particular colours are Christians. And this was a time when there were hundreds of kids coming on Friday nights to our different youth gatherings. There were even more Christian kids who were part of the local public schools who were may have gone to other churches but were adjacent to Soul Revival and the things that we were doing, particularly in Kirrawee High and Gymea High, 2 of the high schools in our part of the world in Sutherland Shire. And So what it did when you were wearing those colours, it stood out, and you could see, and people were wearing them as bracelets or as necklaces. Some people put them, threaded them into the laces of their skate shoes and things, that school shoes.
It was like right at the front of your shoe too.
Yeah, that's right. You got to pull all the laces out, thread it right at the start, and then thread your shoe back up again. So it was a fair bit of commitment to do, but it was a really important thing. It was something that people did a lot and took really seriously. And then we made flags out of it, and we had T-shirts. People would dye their hair different colours. I remember there were 5 guys that in there, it was, I don't know if it was their year 10 or year 12 graduation, but they went to their formal with the 5 colours, and they got tuxedos in the 5 different colours and dyed their hair to match their tuxedo colour. And so it was a really, really popular semiotic, and it was something that was really important to us. In terms of how did it help us share the gospel, what it did was that it presented the story in a really clear and comprehensible way. So everyone could know, okay, this is the story of the Bible. And of course, there's a lot more depth and detail that we spend the rest of our lives digging into. But if you can remember those 5 colours, then you basically know the whole overarching story of what God is doing in this world, from creation and new creation, and how we are caught up into that story. And so the simplicity of it means that every child, teenager, young adult can actually go and talk to their mates about the Jesus story. And when people are asking, what do those colours mean? Oh, well, let me tell you, green, white, black, red, yellow. And you can sort of explain what that means.
Did you get asked that question yourself?
Well, I had an interesting experience, different to most of the teenagers in youth group at the time. So I was at a Christian school. And from what I can recall, it was really only me and one friend who were at Shire Christian School. And we would go to youth group on a Friday night, and there'd be 80 other teenagers, mostly from Kirrawee High and a couple from Gymea High and a few other spatterings around. So we were in an environment where the gospel story was really known. Certainly not everyone at the Christian school was Christian and had personal faith, but it was a really known thing. And so it wasn't unusual for us to sort of be known for knowing the story. On the flip side, though, we had a much stricter dress code. And so I would get in trouble if I tried to wear the Jesus colours at school, whereas those at the state school, which had a much more lax dress code, would get away with wearing the colours kind of wherever they wanted, because there was less enforcement of those kind of rules.
Yeah. Well, that was, I remember, I think it was more on the wane in terms of the popularity of the Jesus beads when I was around at the time in the youth community. But I think, I do remember still people having it on their skate shoes. I think I actually made some myself. That was something I would often do. I think it might have been at a youth camp. No, I don't think I went on any youth camps. I'm trying to remember when I made them, but I made a necklace and I wore it like that. But
I think it was a fairly regular, maybe once a year, maybe even twice a year, that you would do that 5 colours as the talk or the teaching time at youth group, and you would often make the colours in some sort of variety as part of what you did that night. So there was a very intentional communicating of what those colours meant and how to share it with others and practice those conversations and those kinds of things.
Yeah, it definitely helped me remember the story. I remember that. I don't know if I got asked many questions for wearing a particular necklace or a bracelet. I can't remember that. But Braden, is that something that ended up happening for you as well? Like, you were a bit younger than me, so was that the Jesus beads a popular thing for you?
Yeah, so I was at high school at the end of, I guess, the noughties and early 2010s. I would say a little bit on the wane, but still very popular amongst we were the Gymea Anglican Soul Revival at the time. Still very popular. I remember sharing, I had a friend who got their braces done in that colour and used that as a good excuse to talk to their orthodontist and the nurses that were helping out, and got to share the gospel that way. I remember it was still very popular, the flag, and I remember it still being a very identifiable thing within that community and a good opportunity to share, but maybe not as widely widely used, but still passionately used by a number of people. And I think had them on my shoes. That was still definitely a thing. I think as fashion trends changed, there was less necklaces and things, but
less kind of 90s skate vibe to it, more, I don't know what you would call it, but
but I still remember people using it a lot and it being very helpful. And I feel like the less it was widely known, the more questions happened.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah. Okay.
And as Soul Revival has sort of grown and matured from the youth community at Guyman Anglican into the own church, which we are now, those colours have also matured, and so we've now done courses based on that. We have some YouTube videos. Maybe we can put those in the show notes.
Absolutely.
The links to the little videos that explain each one. And so we still use it as a church as a way of communicating the broad outline of the gospel story.
One more question on the Jesus Beats for both you guys. Did it help you, was it good to see other Christians wearing those beads? Did you feel like, oh yeah, it helps with the identity?
I definitely feel like because it was something that I associated with a lot of the kids older than me. I think it was very encouraging, especially when you I remember being a new Christian. I was in year 7, and it was cool to see kids in year 12, so near the end of high school, and you're at the start walking around, rocking them and being bold. I think that's always pretty encouraging and fun. And it just meant you would see people around in the playground and stuff, and it was and again, coming from a public school rather than a Christian school, I think it was definitely encouraging to see those people around the playground, even if they were just playing handball or something. It was cool. I know that they are Christian, and it is I think the colours are quite identifiable. I feel like you don't see those 5 colours in that specific order around. I think that is encouraging as well, because you know that it's intentional.
I think the encouragement was really important too, as both Brad and I are from a non-Christian background, and I think that was something that was really important to feeling encouraged and having the confidence to go, I can wear this because other non-Christians are wearing it, and I'm a non-Christian as well. So I think that was helpful. Is there anything else that you wanted to add for the?
Yeah, I just think that absolutely there's that identity that you have, and that it's an obvious outside sign that these people believe in a particular truth and they live in a particular story, which is in some ways unusual for Reformed evangelical Christians. We don't have particular clothing, we don't have particular things that identify us. You might have Orthodox Jews, or you've got Muslims that have a particular style of dress. They've got particular, really clear, identifiable clothing that says, there's someone who is part of that community, that cultural group, that religion. Whereas part of evangelical Reformed culture is that we don't have those kind of clothing. We don't have a particular shirt that we wear, or a headscarf, or any of those kinds of things. And so having something like that, particularly during that moment in time, that did fit the aesthetic of that, as you say, the skate punk kind of thing, then it did identify, and there was that solidarity there. And so I can imagine for Braden and yourself, Joel, and others who are at public schools, particularly, to be able to look at it and say, oh yeah, there are other Christians here, and that in itself is quite encouraging and solidifying for a young Christian.
And something, I suppose, with our youth community being perhaps around 80% non-Christian, from non-Christian background, I think that was a really powerful semiotic, as we talked about. So we're talking about evangelism. I noticed that you just said, as Reformed evangelicals, we often tend to fade into the background. I think this is going to be quite an interesting point that we're going to talk about. But should we perhaps first define what evangelism is, and what the reason that we're talking about it? Do you want to help us with that, Tim? Because you've got way more training than I do.
So the word evangelism comes from the Greek word for good news and gospel, which is used right throughout the scriptures. And so when Jesus goes out and starts his ministry, Mark chapter 1 is kind of an early use of this. Jesus goes into Galilee proclaiming the good news. And that's that word. It's euangelion is the Greek word, which we've sort of transliterated into English as evangelism, but it basically just translates, it's the good news. And so when we evangelize, we're sharing the good news. At Soul Revival, we often talk about sharing the truth and love of Jesus, person to person, culture to culture, generation to generation, place to place, space to space.
Well
I've
done.
got them all?
Got them all.
Excellent. And so what we're doing, that's evangelizing, communicating that truth of the story of Jesus. And part of that comes with there's an expected result of those who are hearing. And so when Jesus goes out to explain the good news, to evangelize, he says the kingdom of God has come near, repent and believe the good news. So it's a message that has an expected response. And so part of what we do when we are evangelizing is we're explaining the truth and love of Jesus. But there's an intention there that there will be some sort of response. We want people to come to know that it's not just a factual, oh, that's kind of interesting. Thank you for letting me know that interesting factoid about a historical person. There's a deepness to it. We're actually expecting personal transformation through that, which again has been a hallmark of evangelical and reformed culture.
Wow, that's a good way of looking at it. You've been part of ministry for a very long time. Is that something that you see happen, and it's something that we should want to see more of? Is that personal transformation? Do we see people respond to the good news and then they? I'm just wondering, like, we're talking about why perhaps we haven't looking at evangelism, but it's like really cool to talk about the things that are really important and also really encouraging and exciting, of that when we do share the good news, we see that transformative effect. I was just wondering if you've got any stories like that you might like to share about you've seen people be transformed.
Yeah, it's a great question. I spend most of my ministry in children's ministry. And when we think about children, developmentally, what's going on for them with faith is often they're experiencing and living out the faith that is part of their family and part of their community. And so we do expect to see transformation there. Well, I love to see kids become more patient, more kind, more self-controlled. And that does happen. We see that transformation in them. But what happens particularly as children go through adolescence is there is that process where they're having to differentiate the beliefs that they had from their family to those that are true of themselves. And so that's why in youth ministry, you often see a lot of conversions. Yeah, people becoming Christians. I know a lot of this, we talked about it on the Chip Lunch podcast, and as you hear people's stories, that's often somewhere in youth and adolescence is where people are starting to make those connections, because that's exactly what's happening developmentally. It's happening with all sorts of different things. It's happening with your choice of movies and music and the foods that you like and the types of things you do on your weekend. All of those things as an adolescent, you're working out, what did my family believe and do in that space? But now who am I? And you're asking that question. And so certainly in youth ministry, you see a lot of that transformation where people are saying, yeah, actually, I do really want to take this on for myself, which is really exciting. It's really exciting to see teenagers from maybe non-Christian homes that are realising, okay, my parents have this other belief or this non-belief in the person of Jesus, but actually I'm choosing for myself to believe. So there's a differentiation there of them coming from, probably more clearly death to life. They've come from, a non-belief in Jesus to belief in Jesus, so they've transferred into his kingdom and part of his family. And then you've got those who are from Christian homes who sometimes go through periods of rebellion, sometimes don't, but will come through that process of going, actually, it's lovely that my parents grew me up and raised me to know Jesus as Lord and Saviour, but I'm taking that on really firmly for myself. I'm deciding that this is a moment where I want to take that on and be identified as a Christian in my own right, not just because of my family. And so, we see those all the time as we do, particularly youth and children's ministry, which is really exciting. Yeah,
it must be really exciting. And I think in our running sheet, we've got a heading of why share the gospel. I think that's a fantastic place to start in terms of that, is to hearing the transformative effects that people experience regardless of what age they are of what the gospel does. Would you say that's the most important reason to share the gospel, or is there also some other things that we perhaps, there's the urgency, right, of like, we need to see more of that happen. Would you agree?
Oh, absolutely. If the gospel is true in its totality, that those who are in Christ are in Christ for all of eternity, and those who are not in Christ are not in Christ for all of eternity, then we have eternity at stake. And so I know all of us have families, friends, neighbours that are not yet Christians, do not yet believe in Jesus. And of course, we want them to be with us in new creation. We want them to come to a saving knowledge of Christ, both for their good now in this life, but also right through into new creation. And so there is an urgency there. John 3:36, whoever believes in the Son has eternal life. Whoever rejects the Son will not see life, for God's wrath remains on him. So there is an urgency there that we want people to know Jesus for themselves. And there's also an obedience that Jesus actually asks us to go and make disciples. And so there is part of our obedience as disciples is to go and keep sharing that good news, keep telling others about it.
I'm just, as you were going through that list, I was just thinking of all the people I should be evangelizing to. Like, you made me, as you went through all like friends, family, I'm like, all these images of people that I'm like, oh, I need to talk to them. Or need to be at least living it out in a way that shows that I have been transformed myself by Jesus. There's this statistic that you've put in here, Tim, that says that almost 80% of people come to know Jesus before they hit adulthood. So more than you probably know, many of the people around you at your school are open to thinking about Jesus. Is that something that you thought at the time? Like we talked about when you were younger at the time with the Jesus beads. Is that something that you would feel would be true, that most people were becoming Christians at that age?
I don't know if I would have thought about it as a statistic of all those who become Christians. I don't think I would have been thinking that level. But certainly being part of a youth group which had a strong outward focus and a strong evangelism focus in the way that Stu would run the Friday nights, but also the school's ministry is involved with, being in the school for the chip lunches and the other things, and people being encouraged to invite their friends to tell the Jesus bead story to others. There was a lot of people becoming Christians. And so it doesn't surprise me that, yes, a lot of people are becoming Christians. Now, as I've kind of grown up and I'm now 20 years later and have done ministry study and study in the social sciences and psychology and those kinds of bits and pieces, it actually makes sense that adolescence is that time where people are defining their identity. They're working out who they are. And so there is, I guess, a strategic opportunity to particularly invest in children's and youth ministry where people are starting to form their identity of themselves. Of course, people become Christians as adults. We've got a good friend at church, Marty, who is a chaplain in a retirement home, and he's baptised 85, 90-year-olds who have come to Jesus. And it's beautiful to see people who are senior and in the hospital, in retirement, really close to new creation, and then becoming Christian. So of course that happens, and of course it's important to be sharing the gospel with adults as well. But there is something fairly unique about the child and adolescent experience, and so I think it's right for churches and ministries to be prioritising children's and youth ministry, and that will be a way in which we will see many more people come to faith in Jesus.
And it's also obviously fits in with the shock absorber approach, as we talk about, is that the young people are at the forefront of cultural change. We need to be listening to them and hearing what's going on so that we can bring biblical wisdom to bear on those kind of things and how to move forward with that.
That's right, and that's going to be the point of this season, isn't it? Like we've looked at culture. We've said, okay, this is the type of culture that young people are in. Okay, how do we speak to that culture that's been defined by the artists we looked at last season, the different messages that they have? What is the good news? What is the good news for them in that situation, in that culture that they're immersed in? That for us as old men, they are not quite as immersed. Sorry, speak for myself. But we're just a little bit removed from, but still watching and seeing. And so, what is it like to share the good news? How is Jesus good news for the messages that Beyonce and Kanye and Tame Impala and others are speaking?
Yeah, I think so. So we talked about the reasons about why it's so important to share the gospel, but we have termed this season "Whatever Happened to Evangelism." Why? First, I think just before we do that though, would you consider yourself an evangelist, Tim?
Well, that's a great question. As I read through, particularly the New Testament scriptures, I think there's a couple of things going on. So one is, it seems that there are those who have the gift of evangelism. Yes. So Paul talks in Ephesians 4 about those who are, there's different offices, different roles in the church, and one of those is the evangelist. He encourages Timothy in 2 Timothy chapter 4, I think. Timothy, do the work of an evangelist. There are certainly, Jesus says to his disciples, pray that he'll pray to the God of the harvest that he'll raise more workers in the harvest. So there is a work to be done, which is explicitly evangelism. And we know people like that. I mean, Stu Crawshaw is a great example. He is a natural evangelist,
Yes.
And has seen wonderful fruit because of that. So there is a role. I think there are people who have a particular gifting of evangelism. Something else that's going on, though, is it's really curious to me that a lot of Paul's writings, when he's encouraging the churches how to live, he says surprisingly little about that active word-based go out and keep telling your friends about Jesus. He keeps talking about how do we live as a community of God's people, how do we live in a world amongst the outsiders. But there's a couple of really interesting places where he talks about just living a quiet life. In 1 Thessalonians, he says, do your best to live a quiet life, minding your own business. I think that's really interesting. But what he does then is he then shows that living a quiet, godly life actually has an evangelistic effect. And so he has a couple of places where we can see that just the quiet, diligent living of living according to the fruits of the Spirit, living as a disciple of Jesus, being the best possible brother, sister, husband,
I think
wife,
about the
father.
being a peacemaker.
Being a peacemaker, yeah. Do your best to live at peace with outsiders. You know, all of those things actually have an evangelistic effect. So we've got these part in Thessalonians where Paul encourages them to live a quiet life. Make it your ambition to lead a quiet life. Mind your own business, work with your hands. But the very next sentence is so that your daily life may win the respect of outsiders. So there's something about living the quiet life that actually has this impact on the outsiders. They're watching in and saying, oh, that person's really diligent at their work. They're a really faithful husband. They're a really great father. They're patient in traffic. The things that cause others to stress in the work situation don't seem to cause them stress. They're just working diligently. They're really self-controlled and gentle and peaceful. I wonder what's going on there. The other one that's really interesting is in 1 Timothy, where Paul prays, or he says his desire for Timothy is that petitions, prayers, and intercessions be made for all people, for kings and those in authorities, that we may live peaceable and quiet lives. But again, the very next sentence is, this is good and pleases God our Saviour, who wants all people to be saved and come to a knowledge of the truth. So there is something in that living the diligent, quiet life as a Christian, which is actually communicating the gospel. So I think for those of us who are gifted with the gift of evangelism, it's awesome. It's wonderful to see those people in action and to see the way that they communicate, the way that they invite, the way that they're just really bold in encouraging others to come to church and hear the story and share the gospel colours or whatever it is. But there are others who are not, and I think I'd put myself in that other category. I'm not a naturally gifted, extroverted, out the front evangelist, but in living the diligent Christian life, there is something about that which is attractive. There is something about that is shining the light of Jesus, salt and light as Jesus talks about in Matthew, to the outside world. And what the hope is that people will then realise that and inquire about it. And this is what Peter talks about in his letter, is that always be prepared for an answer to the hope that you have. So when people come to you, Joel, at work and go, why aren't you getting stressed while all these other people are being stressed about this project that's going off the rails? And you go, oh, no, I think I've got a peaceableness and a calmness that comes from my faith in Jesus. It might not be exactly those words, but in some way you're able to communicate that, well, I've got eternity. You know, I've got a peace and an assurity of who I am as God's child, Jesus' brother. And so those little things don't stress me much. Why do you never speak ill of your wife at work, Joel? Like all the other guys are having a whinge about their partners. But you're always speaking so positively about your wife and your family. Why is that? And you can say, oh, look, honestly, I have some bad days too. Yeah. But I love them. And because I love them and because I love Jesus, I'm just trying really diligently to speak kind words to them and be gentle with them and to be self-controlled in the language that I use about them in other settings. And so those kinds of things are evangelistic. So your question, do I see myself as an evangelist? Not in the sense of having a gifting of evangelism.
Not in the archetype.
Not the archetype. But I do think that all of us as Christians have the responsibility of being salt and light. Paul talks about shining like stars in the universe in a corrupt generation because of the way that we live. And that does have evangelistic effect.
I think that's a really helpful thing to say, because I suppose that when I was growing up in the youth community and had like hearing different youth talks and stuff, it's like, you got to tell people about Jesus, blah, blah, blah. And I would picture that archetype of the really bold Christian who would just like go and talk to people about Jesus with not caring what they thought of them. And unfortunately, that was something that I probably still struggle with now, is what other people think of me. And so I would put myself in the same category as you, Tim, that I'll probably more just trying to live a peaceful life rather than being a full-on archetypal evangelist.
Yeah.
Was that a similar experience to you, Braden, growing up? Did you have someone that was super bold?
Yeah, I think I was blessed to have some people who, like Tim mentioned, were natural evangelists, also natural extroverts, and very open and sharing and caring. I think it is easy to compare yourself to that when you're not, and be like, oh, I'm obviously less godly, or get down on yourself, or like you said, Joel, if you're worried about what people think of you and you're not necessarily that outgoing in that way, it can be a bit really challenging. And I think coming from the personality type that I am, I'm not a natural evangelist, but I feel like that also, it is a gifting, but it also can be learned and improved upon. Like a lot of things in life, some people are naturally talented at things. Other people just maybe have to work a little bit harder and think a little bit more about it, but that doesn't mean that you don't do it. I think that's been a big thing for my Christian walk, has been realizing that even if things don't come naturally, sharing Jesus is worth it. It's worth being uncomfortable. And just because I am uncomfortable sometimes when I'm trying to figure something out, or do something, or write a talk, or do anything that's maybe not as natural to you as a person, or something that you wouldn't do in outside situations, I feel like that is an encouragement. I like, my least favorite thing at school was public speaking, and yet I probably end up preaching and doing a lot of talks now as part of my role. And I wouldn't say I necessarily enjoy it more. It's just I love Jesus, and that's part of loving Jesus, is wanting to tell people about him. And I think that it's worth putting myself in uncomfortable situations. And that's something that has taken nearly 15 years of growing as a Christian to get to. So I feel like, what you're saying, Joel, is very true. Of like, yes, we some people are natural evangelists, but it's also something you can grow in, and it's also something that it can take a while to grow in. And like a lot of things in your Christian walk, you just keep plugging away at it, and it's surprising how far you get.
It was a continual process of sanctification, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And I think the important thing is that there's lots of different ways in which we can speak the truth and love of Jesus to those that we know. And yes, there'll be those who will just invite every one of their work colleagues to church and just be really bold and have no embarrassment about doing that, and be able to share the gospel really clearly like that. There's people who will do cold evangelism, just walk up to people in the street or at the uni door knocking and share the truth and love of Jesus. I think that's really bold and great. And as Braden said, you can grow those skills and grow a capacity for that. I had another story. It was when I was a teenager. I was at Heathcote train station, which is again down South Sydney, and just listening to music and minding my own business, and sat down on the seat waiting for the train. And after a while, the station manager kind of wandered out and said, "Oh, excuse me, did you notice the piece of paper next to you? And I said, no, not really. And I turned and looked, and I realised that it was a Christian tract. Mm-hmm. And we got talking, and he was trying to evangelise me. I was already a Christian at this point. So I said, oh, this is really interesting. Like, do you do this often? And yes, it turns out that whichever station he was kind of on for that day, he would just leave a couple of Christian tracts on the seats. And then if the opportunity arose, he would go and just start to have a conversation with people. He was not a raging extrovert. He was quite a quiet and reserved type personality, but he was putting himself in a particularly awkward situation. And I've got no idea what his bosses would have thought of that if they knew that he was doing this on the job. But he was willing to put himself out there, a little bit awkward, not a seasoned professional, not a professional speaker by any means, but he was willing to have an awkward conversation for the sake of someone reading a tract and hearing a little bit about the message of Jesus. Anyway, we became not close friends, but I would see him often at different train stations and as guarding a train, and we would always give a big wave and encourage each other. And so I think those things are really great. So yes, you can have people who will just go and speak really boldly. You'll have people who will invest and train themselves into awkward situations. And then when we think about these living a quiet life, there's just how do we actually intentionally show the truth and love of Jesus in the things that we do. I had one youth leader growing up who would say the best way to evangelise your non-Christian parents is to grab a tea towel after dinner. Yeah. And it was just this simple reminder that how many teenagers are going to willingly help their parents with their housework? Well, not many, but maybe one who has been changed by Jesus might. And so even just that would just, let me help you, Mum. Let me help you wash and dry up. I can take care of that. And that again will just start maybe slowly over time. Oh, that's really kind. Why are you doing that? It's just something that came up at youth group. We've just been encouraged to love our parents because we love Jesus.
Breaking the stereotype of teenagers not doing any housework.
Yep. And it doesn't have to be, why are you wiping up? Well, because you should know Jesus and you should come to church, otherwise you're going to hell. It's just just the gentle, I've just been thinking about how I can best love you. It's something we've been talking about at church, at youth group. And so just those little things will help, again, be prepared to give an answer for the hope that we have.
I think that where we're all kind of going towards is that we should all, as Christians, we should all be evangelists. But it's really, God's given us different gifts in the way that we actually can do it.
That's right.
So then we don't have to be the full-on bold, you called it actually, Braden, the natural evangelist. I think that we should all probably be natural evangelists. It's just how we actually do it. So if we all do have those gifts and we can be evangelists in our own way, why are we saying on this podcast that there's a problem with evangelism?
I think one of the things we've noticed is that the talk of evangelism seems to be in a bit of a decline. And so one of the things we're interested in exploring this season is why that is the case. Is there something going on in the wide culture? Is there something going on in Christian culture? Is there something going on individually for us, which is sort of slowed down this momentum of evangelism, that we don't feel an urgency about it. Maybe we feel an awkwardness about it. And so we want to explore that from a number of different angles. One thing that I had thought of, which I read about recently, as we were talking about this season, was some research that came out of the US. So there's a group called Barna, and they do a lot of really great research in sort of religious and Christian circles in the USA. And they did some research on all the different generations, but particularly looking at millennials. So that's those born from the sort of mid-80s to the end of the 90s. So I think all of us would just scrape into that.
I think so.
The millennial age bracket. And one of the things that they were looking at is what is the attitude towards evangelism from those different generations. Some of the good news that came out of that is that almost all practicing Christians across all generations believe that part of their faith means being a witness about Jesus to others. So that would fit into that evangelism. You want the outsiders to know about Jesus.
95 to 97%.
Yeah, so really, really high.
Yep.
And almost an insignificant number of those who are practicing Christians would say, oh, no, I don't think I need to be a witness. So that's really encouraging. Also, amongst all practicing Christians, believe that the best thing that could ever happen to someone else is for them to know Jesus. And so depending on the generation, that was 94 to 97%. So that's really good. So they know that they want to. They know that it's the best thing that possibly happened for one of their non-Christian parents, peers, etc., to become a Christian. And millennials in particular felt equipped to do that. And so there was some great research that said that almost 3/4 say they would know how to respond when someone raised questions about their faith. And so they do feel that they're, like Peter says, be prepared to give an answer for the hope that you have. So they're all really good indicators that millennials in particular, but all generations, are willing and ready to share their belief about Jesus with others. But then there was something really surprising. And this was that almost half of millennials agree that almost half of millennials agree at least somewhat that it's wrong to share one's personal beliefs with someone of a different faith in the hopes that they'll one day share the same faith. So we have this now clash where they're saying, yes, the best thing that could possibly happen for this other person is for them to become a Christian. I feel equipped that I could answer their questions if they came. But of that same group of practicing Christians, half of them don't want to engage in an evangelistic conversation with someone else in order to change that person's faith. How does that come across to you?
Very interesting, isn't it? Why do people feel so prepared to do it, but then not ready to do it? Because we've just spoken about how we don't have to be the big shot. Sorry, I shouldn't call them big shots. The guys and girls that are very bold to be able to talk about Jesus. You don't have to be like that. You can be doing it in the way you live or the way you speak to people, all those kind of things. So why does that mean, unless it's they think that they need to be like that, that's the only way that they can actually be evangelistic? But why do they feel like they need to not share it? Why do they feel like they're unable to share it even though they say they are able to share it? That doesn't make sense. I wonder with the previous seasons we talked about individualism. I wonder if that's playing into it a little bit. It's a little bit like the millennial thing of you do you, I just do whatever I want. I can, as long as you stay over there and do your thing, I can do my thing here, and it might be a cultural thing. Brady, did you want to jump in on that?
Yeah, I think echoing my experience at high school, very much that you do you, I'll do me, we can coexist.
Live in harmony.
Well, I don't mind what you're doing as long as it doesn't affect what I'm doing, is very strong. I remember, so I'd been going to youth group for a little while. I remember my mum sat me down and basically said, I'm happy for you to do whatever you want. I'm not a religious person. You can be a religious person. I don't mind, but just leave me and Dad out of it. Right. Was basically the gist of that. And I think is a lot of people's attitude is they're very happy for people to be doing whatever makes them happy as long as it doesn't affect anyone else. And I feel like that has really affected, I think, that evangelism in that way, where people are maybe more equipped. There's lots of training. There's lots of different ways that you can learn and try and think about and grow as an evangelist. But then when it comes to sharing with other people, I think that attitude of makes it harder. It makes it harder to talk to people. And for me, it even made it harder for me to talk to people that I am close with because they had put up that wall pretty quickly.
And you think it's a response also to the individualism that we talk about? We've spoken about how individualism is very much on the increase and has been almost from the 70s, 80s, even the 60s when we've gone back there. And I just wonder if people perhaps become so individualistic that if you say, no, you might need to change how you're thinking as an individual, do they feel, in a sense, maybe judged? And then if you're bringing a message of hope and a message of perhaps transformation with Jesus, then that's even more likelihood that the people who are sharing it think they might offend those people or feel like they are judging them?
Yeah, and I think that's part of our cultural moment, is that there's this feeling that disagreement means judgment. And this actually came out in the study as well. So millennials were twice as likely than Gen Xers, which is the next generation up, and 3 times more likely than boomers, which is kind of our parents' generation, to believe that disagreement means judgment. And so this is where that, I think that awkwardness, like Braden shared about his mum sitting down and saying, look, I don't mind that you have a religion, but I don't, and it's okay for us to disagree about this as long as we don't really talk about it. And so there's that feeling that it's okay to have different opinions, but as soon as you disagreeing with me is actually telling me that I'm wrong, that I'm feeling judged. And this is the thing about, if the Jesus story is true, then it's true for everyone. It's not just a matter of opinion. It's just, it's nice that you have this belief and I've got this belief, and kind of like, ice cream flavors. It's okay that you like that flavor and I like this flavor, and we can mix and match whatever we want. If the story of Jesus is actually what the Bible says it is, then it impacts everyone and everyone's eternity. And so we do have something that we believe is objectively true, not just subjectively true. What's true for you is true for you, and it doesn't really matter what you believe. But we live in this cultural moment where being peaceable with others and not letting disagreement and judgment get between friends means that we can often be really slow to share those important truths with other people.
And also could be harder too, right? So,
absolutely.
So I feel like it's almost our cultural moment has almost gone beyond just I'll do whatever I want. It's now I belong to this particular tribe, and again, then bringing the judgment aspect of, like, if I say that you might need to switch tribes, then it's even greater judgment on me that I have chosen the wrong tribe, and it's an attack on not just me as a person, but also the tribe that I say that I belong to, whatever that might be,
and my individualism. So if I've chosen this for myself, how dare you tell me that I've chosen wrong?
Yeah, and I mean the thing that I think about when you're talking about that is the ability to have a conversation with someone who is extremely disagreeable to you, or maybe just disagreeable, let's not say extremely, but still walk away going, maybe I learnt something, maybe I need to do this better. It's the idea of civil discourse I think has been really lost. And I think it's interesting that we spoke about millennials feeling that they're prepared to share the gospel. I think that might be because millennials are the first generation to really experience the internet en masse. So they maybe feel like I can get all my answers off the internet.
Yeah.
But the problem also with the internet, I think the internet has a great many good things and also a great many not great things. The problem is that the internet, in the way that it has transpired, has come that if internet companies can keep you in a tribe, they're more likely to make more money. So the idea of Facebook having an algorithm that goes, I'm only going to feed you certain things that you're interested in because that means I can give you more personalized ads, which means Facebook can make more money. I think that fuels it as well from the other side, is that we can't have a good discussion between disagreeable groups a lot of the time, it's not being allowed because exactly what we're talking about is that the civil discourse has been lost because the tribalistic instincts now are like, well, we can't switch tribes. We can't be any part of this group. We can't. So the encouraging thing is that the story of Jesus and the gospel and the good news that we talked about at the start of this podcast is that it transcends all of that, and that we can actually do it. I suppose we can actually do it and be part of that civil discourse without upsetting people. It's more about the time that I think is the time to be able to have those discussions is perhaps being lost. I think about, there's this, recently read that Joe Rogan, and whether you agree with Joe Rogan or not, I don't care, but we shouldn't get into that, but he is becoming one of the most influential media figures in the world, especially in America, because there's a contrast of perhaps the cable news networks that have to have bite-sized things that really become very tribalistic, and this is how you need to think, and this is what's happened in this story and all that kind of stuff. Whereas Joe Rogan, who does 3.5 hour long podcasts, it's the complete opposite of that, and is giving people the freedom that are on his podcast to actually develop their own thoughts and thinking. So when you perhaps the contrast between how the news is presented and how Joe Rogan is perhaps presenting people's point of view, it's like, well, if I can stick through a 3.5 hour podcast, I actually know this person's point of view better. And it's okay for me to disagree with some of the things, and I might agree with some of the other things, but I've had the time to be able to listen. There's a lot of things I talked about there, sorry, Tim, but do we have the time to be able to have those conversations? That's the other thing.
Well, I think we should be making the time, but it also represents why our relationships are so important. And the really interesting thing about long-form podcasting is not just being able to hear people's extended views, which I think I find really helpful. I've heard long-form interviews with people I knew I disagreed with going into, but hearing them for an hour and a half explain their position and argue back and forth with the presenter sometimes, you really get to hear the nuance in what they're saying, and they become less of a caricature and more of a real embodied person with nuanced understandings. But the other thing which is really significant is that if we're listening to a particular podcast or a particular personality, we feel like we know them and that we're in a deep relationship with them. We talked about this with Taylor Swift and how she had been a really early adopter of engaging with her fans through MySpace, and then transferred that to the different types of social media that she's engaged with since then. And so there's this deep level of commitment by her fans because they feel that they genuinely know her and they feel seen by her as well. And I can appreciate that. I've got a couple of podcasts that I listen to and hosts that I've listened to them for so long, and their podcasts so much their identity and their personality, and they're on Twitter, and I get to see them interacting there, both professionally and sometimes just personally. They're sharing their dog pictures and their child that's gone to college, and so there's a sharing of the world, and so there's a relationship there, and God has built us for relationships, and so we feel, of course, Joe Rogan is going to be super influential because the people who are spending time with him are spending so much time with him. And so they are going to be influenced by his views and his personalities. And so, I mean, I guess one tip is to pick our conversation partners wisely. Who is it we're listening to and spending time with? Because we will become more like them. But in terms of our topic in evangelism, I think one of the important things is to really develop our in real life relationships and our friendships, those who we are at school with and work with that live next door to us. The fact that I can feel like I know a podcast host more than I can know my next door neighbour is probably, it is a deficit. It's probably a condemnation on me and the amount of time that I've actually spent investing in my neighbour's life. And so who am I more likely to influence? Someone on, a listener on this podcast, or someone I'm listening to and consuming their media, or the person I actually live next to and can invite around to dinner and can mind their dog and, look after their mail when they're on holidays. And that person I'm going to have more influence over. They are going to see my life. They're going to see me living that quiet, peaceful life in all godliness and holiness. And so that will then raise questions and, why are you always like that? And so we want to embed ourselves well into our real life communities and our real life relationships. And I think that also frees us from a number of those things and dangers that we know exist in social media and on the online space as well. And this comes out again in that the importance of relationship comes out in the survey, in that the millennials are really very aware of the relationships that they have with other people. And it's the relationships they have with other people that both help them to evangelize, but also worry them about evangelizing. So within the Barna study, the 44% of millennials said they would admit to avoid a spiritual conversation if they knew their non-Christian friend would reject them. So they are concerned about rejection. They're concerned about their friendships. And that's a real reality for them. That is how they're feeling. And so when opinions are quite hot and you can feel like you might lose a friendship over this, is it worth losing a friendship over this? And you've got to think about that. But interestingly, there was another study from Lifeway, which is another Christian research company in America, who said that millennials are the only age group out of all the different generations where the percentage of those evangelizing was actually increasing. So they're noticing a different trend where the X's and the boomers may be lessening their evangelism. Millennials are actually doing more of it. So we've got to put all this together. There's always lots of intricacies with survey data. But I think it is encouraging that the millennials and more so our Gen Zs, which are the ones who now are in primary and high school, that to equip them and encourage them that in this cultural moment, as they are the shock absorber to our churches, to be hearing from them, to hearing what it is like to be in their world, to genuinely hear these anxieties that they have. I might lose a friend over this. I'm not sure if I'm prepared for that. And for us as the older, what do we call it, the strength in the shock absorber from the established church and those who are more mature saints, to be able to feed back into them as well and to encourage them and equip them in what they need in order to evangelise their family, friends, neighbours, etc.
Yeah, cool. I always like to take the position of trying to help people that are listening to this podcast. We bring up lots of different thoughts and things that we can actually start maybe applying to our lives. I'm just wondering if someone's thinking about, maybe someone's been convicted and listening to this, like, I need to be more evangelistic, whether it is going to talk to someone or being peaceable or, minding your neighbour's dog, those kind of things. How can we encourage our churches to be encouraging their church goers that we can all be evangelists, that it's not over? Like, we're talking about whatever happened to evangelism, and we've spoken about what some of the reasons are. How can we reverse that trend that people aren't willing to share the gospel?
Yeah. Keep listening to the entire season. Yeah. Like, subscribe. But I think one thing is, because it is relational, and so one thing we can do is just get to know our peers, colleagues, neighbours better. And one of the things that's really important to us as a church is meals. We do meals all the time at church, but being able to be hospitable with your time and your house as well. This is something I struggle with. We are a busy family. We have a lot of commitments and not a lot of margin, it feels, for those kinds of things. But that's something that I can certainly be doing myself, is thinking about how do I invite my neighbour in for a drink, for a coffee, for a meal, get to know them. There's a great quote by Francis Schaeffer, which I use in training occasionally. He talks about, if I had an hour with someone, I would spend 55 minutes listening and then 5 minutes trying to share some aspect of the truth with them. That's butchering of the quote, but that's about it, what it is. And that can be that first step of evangelism, particularly for those who we are in deep relationships with, and we want to maintain those relationships. We don't want to lose a friend. That's a real concern that we have. But we also want them to see how beautiful Jesus is. Yeah. We want them to see the transformed life. We want them to see the beauty in amongst the mess that is the Christian church. And we want them to know that the best thing for them right now is to come into relationship with Jesus and be with him through all of eternity. And so the first step towards that might be have them over for a dinner and just listen to them talk about their life, ask questions. Let them talk about their concerns. Listen, be attentive to the things that they bring them joy, that they worry about, that they're nervous about. How are they feeling about the COVID at the moment? Is the real pressing thing. Like, how are you feeling about that? Are you feeling nervous? Are you feeling safe? All of those kind of concerns, and just listening to them and creating opportunities where we can have those conversations, and in amongst that, being visible. That our quiet life, minding our own business is, yes, minding our own business, but it's also minding our own business with an outward trajectory as well, so that others will see our good life and will raise questions, and we can start to have those conversations. I think
the main point that you're talking about there is listening, and I think that's just such a great way to show, as you said before, a reason for the faith that you have. And I think it's just an exceptional way of loving people. We've talked about that over so many seasons now. It's whether it's listening to the young people in our church, our episode with Michael Duckett, we spent a lot of time listening
to our First Nations people.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I think listening is just what's the right word? It's a very easy but a great example of Jesus' love that has transformed us, so we can go, we're listening to you, we care about you, and then people are questioning, oh, why is that? And hopefully we can give an answer in terms of it's because of Jesus.
Yeah.
So I think that's where we want to head with this, obviously, and we're going to talk about different ways that that's happened throughout history as well. During this season, we've talked about embracing and critiquing culture, but how did the former revivalists do that, and also then still see lots of people come to Jesus? So I think that's going to be really cool. We're also going to talk about a ton of other stuff in terms of historical context, like I said, but also we'll have some guests on that will be able to help us to talk about that too. So I'm actually really, really looking forward to this season. I think it's a great way to actually get the discussion going, that perhaps we may be able to be part of a revival again. We're called Soul Revival Church, so hopefully we can be part of it. Any final words, final thoughts, Tim, before we wrap it up?
I guess the main thing would be great to hear back from our watchers and our listeners on your experience with evangelism. What are your stories? Do you feel like, I know that many of our listeners are in churches and even church leadership. What is evangelism like in your setting? Do you feel that it is at the forefront of what you're doing as a church? Or as you look around your ministries and your churches, I wonder what did happen to evangelism. It doesn't seem to be that priority. Maybe you've got a different perspective than what we've seen. And so it'd be great to hear stories and hear strategies that people have used in order to engage their friends and neighbours and family for the sake of knowing Jesus.
Absolutely. And even any revivals that you'd like to have a real look at, so we might be able to do that too.
Yeah, you got your pet favourite revival?
Pet favourite? I don't know if I have one of those.
You don't have a favourite revival?
No, not at the moment.
No, well,
I'm sure someone will tell me, and then I'll research, and then that'll become my favourite one. But you can get in contact with us around all those topics by a number of ways. The first way is to just subscribe and listen to the podcast. That'd be great. Or watch us on YouTube if you like. You can go to the website, shockabsorber.com.au. You can email me, joel@shockabsorber.com.au, or you can jump on the Discord channel, which will be in the show notes. So there's all those ways to get involved, get stuck into the conversation. And we're going to start talking about evangelism this season, and we'd love to be hearing more people chat to us about it. But for now, let's wrap it up. Thank you very much for your time, Tim.
Pleasure, Joel, as always.
It's been lovely. And Braden, thank you very much for your time on sound and also on the microphone.
No problem.
We really appreciate it. And as always, thank you everyone to listening. We really love that you're really supporting us and getting involved, so we love it. So to finish off, one way.